All right, so we are downloading, what is it? University crime data.xlsm. This is the same data we worked with last time we got together, except last time we got together we worked with individual files, the original source files. This data that we have now is that same data just downloaded into, all put into one workbook and organized quite a bit differently. Let's see if we can kind of open up what that source data looks like. Here's Texas. So when we look at the source data, what we see is one row has lots of information about a particular college campus. But now, as we look at this data, it's the same data, but now we have only one number per row, right? We don't have all these numbers on this row. We have one number per row, and then all the rest of this just gives us context for that number. So here is 28. What is that? That is burglary, crime category for Jacksonville State University in the state of Alabama in 2006. This data is organized really well to work with a pivot table. So that's the task for today is to be able to automate pivot tables. So just by show of hands, how many of you say, you know what, I'm already pretty comfortable with pivot tables, just using pivot tables? Okay, it's about half. And then how many of you are saying, you know, I've tried pivot tables a couple of times, they're still a bit mystical to me? A few of you. Okay, so we're going to spend just a little bit of time kind of understanding how pivot table works, but most of today is going to be focused on how to automate pivot tables. So we've got this data right here, and let's go ahead and build a pivot table. So the plan here is we're going to build one pivot table first, just for practice. Then we're going to record ourselves building a pivot table, and then we're going to go modify that code. It turns out the code that gets recorded for pivot tables, it's a little bit ugly. But without too much effort, we're going to be able to clean it up quite a bit, and you'll see. When we're done cleaning it up, you'll go, wow, it was frightening when we first looked at it, but now it doesn't look too bad. So that's where we're at. Very first time I went to build a pivot table in Excel 2007, which is when we first had the ribbon. I'm not kidding you when I say I spent about an hour looking for where the pivot table was. Somehow in my mind, I thought it's an advanced thing, so it'll probably be over here somewhere to the right. On whatever ribbon it is, it's got to be far over here to the right. And it's the very first one on the insert. I looked across this tab. I should have Googled it long before I got to an hour. I finally found it. But there it is. So it is kind of an advanced thing, but it's right here. So I'll select that. I'm on my data. I'll select pivot table. It says, great, you can't build a pivot table on one cell, so it's going to automatically expand out to the contiguous data. And we'll put it on a new worksheet. That sounds great. Huh. Whoa. I remember the first time I ever built a pivot table was in the early 2000s. And I just kind of heard about pivot tables, and it was a somewhat new feature in Excel, and I thought I probably should learn about this since I teach programming in Excel. I thought I should probably know something about pivot tables. And I got this far. And back then, when you create a pivot table, this part didn't come up automatically. So I got to here. And I was like, okay, what's next? And that was it. That's how far I got. I was like, all right, I guess I'll look at this later. And yeah, now I forget how to show that. Show field list. Okay. So this is just saying, hey, we're going to put the pivot table over here. Why don't you give us something to summarize? The whole idea behind a pivot table is it allows us to summarize numbers according to multiple dimensions simultaneously. So if I look at my data, go back to my data, the number is in a column called value. And so if I come back to my pivot table, that value, that's what I want to summarize. I'm going to bring that over here and drop this into my values area. So I'm just going to drag value down to values. Say, aha, it's going to give us the sum. So this number is utterly meaningless. And here's the reason. If we look here into crime data, what we're seeing is that we've got two different kinds of data. We have information data and then crime data. Enrollment is no crime, but the rest of these are crimes: assault, auto theft, burglary, rape, larceny, murder, robbery. So the rest of these are all crimes, but what we're doing right now is just the sum of column G. And so it's mixed in enrollment numbers with crime numbers, and so not very helpful by itself. So let's go ahead then and extend this out. What we'd like to do is say, well, I'd like to break that number out. Let's put a filter on it first. So let me take a filter. There's a thing called type. I'll put as a filter for the whole report. And type just lets us know, hey, is this information or is it crime? So now that I've got that filter on there, I can say, oh, what I want to see is the information fields. now that sum is somewhat meaningful. Not so meaningful as it would be if it were an average. So I'm going to change this to an average just by clicking on a little drop-down list over here under Sum of Values and Value Field Settings. And instead of sum, I'm going to choose average. That's a number that's meaningful. The only kind of information that we have here is this is enrollment. So that is the average enrollment for these institutions across these multiple years. It's about 12,000 students per institution. That's the average. We want to see the average crime. That's the average crime. I'm not sure the average crime is so interesting as it would be. The sum of crime is a little more interesting because that would show us all the incidents of crime in our whole data set. So maybe I'll switch this back to sum and take a look at it. So in this data set, we have 416,000 reported crimes that we're looking at. Only 31,000 rows, but some of these rows have multiple. So we look at right there. That row says there were 70 incidents of larceny at Jacksonville State University in 2006. Okay, so we get the sense that we can kind of play around with what goes into this sum. The neat thing about a pivot table is I can see multiple things at once. So I don't have to just say I want to look at one value and sum it. I can say let's take the state and bring that in as a row. And so now I can say if I look at Alabama in this data set, there are 6,391 incidents of crime reported in this data set. And Alaska, Arizona, all of them. Of course, since I've got a grid here, 2 dimensions, I'd like to put another dimension up here. And I'm going to put the label up here at the top. And so now that will split this out. So now I say, okay, in Alabama, there were 76 incidents of assault. There was 1,201 burglaries, 28 rapes, no murder. There's no murder. No murder on college campuses. Now, where's a deadly college campus? Not so bad here. 3. Who is it? California. Well, I'm not sure that's deadly because California's got a whole lot of students. So, what do you see, Virginia?
Yeah, Virginia has the most.
I wonder if that's this data probably has in it the Virginia Tech shooting. Okay, so, but we're not limited to just 2 dimensions because we can put different levels here on the row. So let's do this. We've got the school there. Let's go ahead and bring the school below state as a row heading. Now that splits out to the school. And then we can even bring campus and bring it down below school. So now that'll split out to the different campuses as well. Where do you say Virginia? You know, this is kind of, it's all expanded right here, so it's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to collapse my state column. So I'm going to right click on Alabama. I'm going to expand, collapse. I'm going to collapse the entire field. There we go. So now I can come down here and find Virginia. I want to collapse the campus as well. Expand, collapse, entire field. Oop! Okay, expand the entire field. And then, is Virginia Tech here?
Virginia College.
Okay, I'm blind. Do I go up or down from where I am?
You're the wrong state.
Oh, I'm in California. That's a problem. I go down, way down. Not that far. Virginia. What was it called?
The second bottom.
Virginia. Oh, Virginia Tech and Virginia Polytechnic. Had 220 murders.
Each.
They had 3. I don't remember that shooting or even really when it was. Anybody remember that? If only we had some kind of connection to a worldwide network of information, we could find some of that. 2008, so I think it probably is a mistake. Okay. So that's the idea of a pivot table. And there's lots of other things that we can do. We can express these not as raw numbers, but like as percentage of the column. You want to know the percentage of the column or percentage of the row and so forth. But let's go ahead and record ourselves doing that so we can get the base things that we need for working with pivot tables, and then we'll start to take a look at the code. So I'm going to delete this sheet, and we're going to go through that same process one more time. But I'm going to record first. So developer tab, record in macro, record macro. I'm going to call it make pivot table. We'll say okay. And then let's just go ahead and go through that same process. I'm going to do it slowly so you can follow me, so our code will be as similar as possible to what we're working with. So I'm in here in the data, insert, pivot table, and say OK. Make a new worksheet. Wonderful. I'm going to start off by bringing down the value into the sum of the values. I will bring in the column, which is label. Next. Then I will bring in my state. And then my school. And then my campus, all three into the rows. So I've got state, school, campus as rows. I will go ahead and make the report here. Let's put the type as a filter. And I'll put report year. I'll do this as a column, but I'll put it above the label. So we'll get report year and then all the information. This really has a lot of data, very sparse. So I have kind of fully spelled, I think I put every column in here. So report year is a column, heading, labels below it. Type is a filter. State, school, and campus are rows, and then our values. Let's go ahead and collapse these as well. I'm going to collapse them in order. So I'm going to right-click here where I see Auburn University. I can see that it's got a campus under it. So I'm going to right-click that and choose Expand Collapse, collapse entire field. Then I'll do the same thing for Alabama. So right-click it, Expand Collapse, collapse entire field. And that'll kind of bring my data back into more summary data, but the user will be able to drill into it. I think I'm going to do the same thing for my year. I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to collapse the, what is this called? The label. So expand, collapse, collapse entire field. And that gives me a pretty good starting point. Now, let's suppose that we have, this data is going to be consumed by Utah folks. So maybe what I want to do is actually expand out Utah. So instead of being all the way collapsed, let's bring Utah out and have that be expanded to begin with. And let's filter this down to crime. We don't really need to see the enrollment numbers in here, so let's take the filter down. So now we've got crime totals for the state, or for all the states, but we've given some focus to Utah because it's extended out here. Let's do one more thing while we're at it, and that is I'd like these labels to stick around when I scroll down. So I'm going to come on to row number 6. In column A, I'll choose View, Freeze Panes, and then Freeze Panes. Give me some code for that too. So now when I scroll, then that top header stays in place. Anything else you want to do to this pivot table before we take a look at the code? I realize I just did a bunch of scrolling, which means I probably recorded myself with lots and lots and lots of statements that says scroll. Well, they're easy to get rid of. All right, I'm going to stop recording and let's go take a look at the code. Folks, when we first look at this code, it will be frightening. But don't Don't panic. We're going to simplify it dramatically. I guess I can close Texas. All right, so modules. Module 1. Here is... We've got all kinds of stuff going on. Here's our make pivot table. I'm going to go ahead, just because we've got kind of restricted amount of screen to state here, I'm going to get rid of these comments and bring this up. So, range C5 we did first. I don't think we really need to select any particular cell. So I'm going to get rid of that one. And we have sheets.add. Now, you'll notice that we've got sheets.add, and then that made a sheet called sheet 2, at least for me. Maybe it did for you as well. But you're going to see that we're going to be referring to that sheet later. So rather than relying on the name, which is going to be difficult, because we don't know what the next name is going to be, let's go ahead and get ourselves a reference to this sheet. So let me dim S as a worksheet. And now when I say sheets.add, let me set S equal to sheets.add. So now we'll capture a reference to that sheet, and I can refer now to that most recently added sheet just with S. All right, I'm going to isolate this next statement, which for me spans 3 lines. I suspect it does for you as well. This just looks daunting. So let's just kind of cut it apart. First object here, active workbook. Not too bad. This is whatever workbook is active. And that's typically how, when we have a reference to a workbook, it gets recorded as the active workbook. That way, if I'm putting this into my personal macro workbook, then I can execute it onto any workbook that we're using. But for this code, it's going to be tied pretty closely to the data that's in this workbook. And so rather than using active workbook, I'm going to back this off to this workbook. What's the difference between active workbook and this workbook? They're both shortcut references to objects, but what's the difference? Yep.
Is this workbook the code name for the one that you're working in?
So, yeah, so active workbook is whichever workbook happens to be active. I have 12 workbooks open. This one's active. Active workbook refers to that. Activate some other one. Active workbook refers to that. This workbook says, hey, see this amount of code right here? It's in some workbook. This is saved in some workbook. So when I say this workbook, it's referring to the workbook that holds the code. It's currently being executed. All right, now pivot caches. What do you think? We've never looked at the pivot caches keyword before, so what can you tell me about it? What do you think it is? Method, object, event, property, statement, what? It's an object, and it's probably a particular kind of object that we've talked about as kind of object. So what would you say it is? It is a collection, yeah. So it's a particular kind of object called a collection. So it probably has a count property. In fact, let's just go ahead and take a look at it. This workbook pivot caches. If you're a collection, you've got a count property. So we'll just ask for the count of that. Sure enough, we've got 1 pivot cache. Oh, by the way, whenever we work with pivot tables, we use the term pivot table. What's pivot cache? Where does the pivot cache come from? Well, here's the thing. So a pivot cache basically is like an intermediary step between the source data and the pivot table. So the pivot cache says, I'm going to connect it to the data source, and then the pivot table gets built on me. Probably most of your work with pivot tables has happened with data that's sitting inside of Excel. We've got like 30,000 rows here in this workbook, and we're going to build a pivot table on it. But where else can you get the data for a pivot table? You can pull it off of a web source. Where else? Corporate database. It could be some external file. It could be some other separate Excel file. So there's lots of different places the data can be. And so the job of the pivot cache is to say, let me hook up to the data. And although I hook onto lots of different kinds of data, once I'm hooked onto the data, then wherever that data is, I'm now the intermediary state for the pivot table to be able to work. So each time I do something with that pivot table, it doesn't have to go back to the source data to be able to refresh. It just has to go back to the pivot cache. Okay, so we've got a collection of pivot caches, and we're calling the create method. We're going to create a new pivot cache. We have parentheses here because we are passing different values to that create method to tell it what kind of pivot cache to create. So we'll come back to these arguments here in just a minute. But there's the closing parenthesis, and then here's something really weird. A dot after a call to the method. Someone tell me what is going on. Go ahead.
The method returning an object, which is then being used, which is, I guess, then Excel VBA is using to use the create pivot table.
That's exactly right. When we create a pivot cache, we call the create method the pivot cache's collection. It creates the pivot cache, but then it returns a reference to that object that just got created. And so everything right up to here gets evaluated as a reference to that newly created pivot cache. And so we can call a method of that object there. I don't want to do all this in one step, so I'm going to break this into 2 separate steps. Right where that dot is, I'm going to break that into a new line. And here we are creating a pivot cache. I want to capture the reference to that pivot cache. Just like we captured the reference to this sheet, I'll declare dim PC as a pivot cache. And so when this gets processed, is this line going to make a new pivot cache? No. This just makes an object that's allowed to refer to a pivot cache. This is the line that's going to create a pivot cache. And so we are going to set PC equal to that newly created pivot cache. So now we're able to create that, and we still have we need the parentheses on the argument list because we're doing something with the return value. What are we doing? We're binding it onto the pivot cache object variable. All right. Anything that we're going to have to do to modify this code? This statement that we have right here. Go ahead.
So our range is static. We want to add more data.
Yeah. So we've got this. The whole idea here, in fact, that's your project for the database management project, is that you're going to be bringing in the 2011 data. You're going to bring it into a database, but the workbook you'll be working on for that project already has a button there that brings the data from the database into the workbook. So the whole idea here is that this data gets updated annually. You need to bring in the new data and then take a look at the pivot table that gets generated. And so we need this not to be static. So probably the simplest way to refer to that range is going to be this. I'll be on that active sheet. So actually, I won't be on the active sheet by the time we say sheets.add. So the name of it, I've got to refer to that sheet. Now if I look over here in my objects, I'll zoom in a bit here. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Look. Zoom where you want. I guess I won't zoom today. So, okay, so we look here in the objects. We see that we've got our crime data sheet. Our sheet that has a label of crime data actually has its own native name of data. And so we should be able to refer to that sheet by saying data.cells. Let's refer to row 1, column 1, A1, dot current region. Address. So that starts in A1, and we've got contiguous data all the way down to row 23,000. And so that sounds pretty good. Now, we've got a problem here, and that is this is a string argument. So this range would do okay for this part, but we're still going to have to get to the name of the sheet here. It turns out that our create method for our pivot caches object can take something besides a string here. So if I actually pass a reference to a range here, it can deal with that just fine. So I don't have to go through the work to take this information and build a string with it. I can just say, you know what, I want the current region for that particular range, and then that will now be a dynamic range. And as I add more data in, it'll reproduce this table for me. And I guess we're making version 6 of the pivot cache. I have no idea the difference between version 6 and version 5. We'll let it be version 6. Questions so far? Okay, so now if we look at the second half of this statement that we were working on, it's saying create pivot table. Well, we want to have access to the pivot table that we create as well, so let me dim PT as a pivot table. Now I'm going to say set PT equal to, I've got something missing right here before this dot. Now I need somehow to be able to refer to that pivot cache I just created. Well, that was the whole reason that we went through the effort to bind the return value of this method onto this variable. So we should just be able to come here and say PC set PT equal to PC. Somebody tell me, what's my syntax error? This is a kind of a tough one to see. Go ahead.
You need parentheses around the create or after the create pivot table.
Right, just like up here, we have parentheses around the argument list because we're doing something with the return value. Same thing here. We have an argument list, we're now doing something with a return value. We've got to put parentheses around it. So it goes, oh, all that goes together. Execute that, and then return it to the pivot table object. All right. I'm going to just put a breakpoint here. It was kind of a substantial code modification that we went through. So I'm going to just run it and make sure that this adds a new sheet, puts a new pivot table. Oh, let's see. Destination here. Oh, we got an issue here. We want to go into row 3, column 1 of our sheet S, or sheet S. Row 3, column 1. That's A3. So I'm just going to say S.range A3. And just like we did up here on this argument, even though it was a string before, it turns out that the create pivot table method can accept a range or a string that identifies a range here. It'll work just fine. I'm looking at this pivot table name and it's got me a little bit nervous. I guess it is your pivot table isn't called pivot table 5, it's probably called pivot table 2. And I was playing with a couple pivot tables before class. So, what do you think? Is that going to be a problem? Yeah, I think he's going to keep trying to create pivot tables with the same name. They're going to be on different sheets. Because the destination is going to be on a sheet. I'm not sure if it really would cause a conflict, but you know what? If we don't tell it the name, I bet it'll figure out a name just fine. Well, that line's a lot shorter. I might even be able to bring that up on the ones on that statement on the one line. Oh, yeah. Now I'm creating a pivot table. And I want to check and make sure that code works. So this should create a new sheet. It should put a pivot table on that sheet. And it shouldn't be configured because I'm stopping before I do any of the configuration. So I'll go ahead and play it. Let's take a look at what it did. Look at that. I made a new sheet, sheet 3. It's got pivot table here. Not configured yet, but I've got a pivot table. And it named it pivot table 6. Even though I didn't tell it to name it pivot table 6, it named it pivot table 6. That's great. So I'll stop my code. Let's make sure that we're working to this point. So if your code's not working here, this would be a good time to let Jaron know and he'll come around and I'll help you. A couple of hands here, so we'll go ahead and pause. Okay, so what we're going to do is, so now we've built the pivot table. Our next step is to get that configured. And one of the neat things about working with pivot tables through VBA is you can say, you know, there may be 4 or 5 different ways that I really like to look at this data. And so you can say, let me build the pivot table, and then let me have some different sub-procedures that configure that pivot table the way that I want to see it. So it might be to say, well, I want to look at it, you know, with the year as a filter rather than as a column label. And sometimes I like to look at this with the state as a filter instead of a row label and just be able to narrow the data down that way. And so it would be really nice if I could just say, these are 4 or 5 different standard configurations. I make 4 or 5 different macros that configure that data, and I can just push it, and it would just pop this pivot table into the different configuration without me having to manipulate it by hand. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to end this sub procedure. So I'll put an end sub right here. And I'll start up a new sub procedure right after it. Sub, I'll call it config1. I'll call it config pt1. Config pt. And then, since this is going to be like my default configuration, maybe the only configuration we have time to get through today. So now I'll say when I make a pivot table, I'm going to call config pt1, and I'm going to pass it a pivot table to work on. So let me pass pt down here. So this will receive a variable called pt as a pivot table. So now when I have other code that I want to modify the way the table is, I can just get a reference to the pivot table, pass it in, and have this configured. And because I named my parameter the same as the variable name that I was using here, this really, my code can now proceed just the same as if this block wasn't here. It was just the same subprocedure. All right, am I going to need to select this sheet? I don't think so. So this sheet already selected. I mean, it's the sheet we just created, so let's delete that. I don't think I have any reason to select A3 either, so I'll get rid of that. All right, let's look at this next block. With active sheet pivot tables, pivot table, good heavens, what have I done? This block here is studying. Do you all have this block?
Yeah.
I didn't get this block in my last class, but I think I was on an older version of Excel. So it's saying the way this is configured. Column brand is true, has auto format. Blah, 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 blah. I think this is something new in the recorder. And these are probably all the defaults. I don't think I even want to play with these. I'm just going to delete this block altogether. Okay, so now it says missing items limit. Interesting. So, this is doing something with the pivot cache still. I was a little bit hasty here. With pivot cache on refresh open. Okay, so I'm actually going to bring this block out of this sub-procedure and I'm going to move it back up here just before we call the subs. So this is saying, hey, I want to refer to the pivot cache that's part of the pivot table that I just created. And we're going to set the refresh on file open equal to false. And missing item limits to this. Well, I have a faster way to refer to the pivot cache than this long statement here. What is it? Yeah. In fact, it's so simple, I'm probably just not going to use the with statement. I'm just going to say PT in front of that one, PT in front of this one. Get rid of the with and the end. Again, these are probably just the default values that I could skip, but if I went through the trouble to record, I will go ahead and include them. And now we can see that down here in our config PT1, we're now starting to manipulate the pivot table itself. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I would like to reduce that reference there. So what is this reference trying to do? Question?
Going back to the what you just used that block of code, was that with statement not reference? It was referencing pivot cache, wasn't it?
Yeah, thank you. My mistake. Very good. Appreciate that. This should be pivot cache, not pivot table. That was the code that was there was referring to the pivot cache of the pivot table. So we have a reference directly to pivot cache. And I lost the doc here as well. Thank you. Okay, so tell me what was the recorder trying to refer to when we wrote this part that I have highlighted? Yeah, that's the pivot table that I just created. The recorder's not smart enough to say, oh, the next time I run this code, we probably want it to refer to the pivot table that was just created. And so it's hard-coded in the name of the pivot table. So how am I going to say pivot table I just created? PT. So PT, repeat all labels, and XL repeat labels. There we go. Again, that's probably default behavior, but I'll leave it in. All right, now let me look at this next statement, see what we can do with it. Active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 5. Again, that's getting just down to the pivot table. I'll replace that with PT. And we're going to add a data field. What are we going to add? Active sheet pivot tables. So there's another reference to the pivot table. I am going to change that to PT. Now it says that pivot table has a whole bunch of pivot fields. And we are going to take one of those pivot fields and we're going to make it a data field. This gets a little bit confusing because we often think the pivot table is the thing we're looking at that has all the summarized numbers in it. Technically, that's the pivot table report. So the pivot table has all of the pivot table has all of these fields. These are the pivot fields. These over here are the data fields. So we're going to add a data field to our pivot table, and we're going to read off one of the pivot fields. Now, we're going to call that sum of value, I think I like that as total better, so I'll change that to total. That's just the label. And this is just a constant that says it's going to be a sum. How is it going to aggregate those numbers? It will aggregate them by sum. And the obvious ones for average, minimum, maximum, standard deviations. Is there a question over here? Okay. Well, I think I kind of want to run this down to this point. Now, if I try to run this, it won't run because this subprocedure requires a parameter. So I'm just going to click in the next field above it, the next subprocedure above it, and we'll execute that. And let's just see what that did. So sure enough, I've got a new sheet here, and I've got my pivot table configured with my total down here in my values. Okay, so now I'm referring to a particular pivot field, the label, and I'm going to change its orientation. I'm going to make it a column field. Right now, it's not anything. I'm going to tell its orientation now to be a column field. And I'm doing two things here. That's why I have the with structure here. We'll go ahead and stop the code. The with structure is saying, all right, I'm going to refer to an object. This is a particular pivot field, and I'm going to change its orientation and position. Now, it turns out I don't really have to change the position. Right now, at this point in my code, I don't have any column fields. So if I add a new column field, I give the orientation to one of my existing pivot fields, I make it a column field, where do you think it's going to go? What position is it going to be in? It's going to be in the number one position. Now, if I have 3 or 4 here, it makes sense to tell what position to go to if I want it to be somewhere besides the last position. But when I add a new column field, it's going to go to the end position. So I don't really have to tell it where to go, especially if I have control over the order in which I execute. So rather than do this with a with structure, let's go ahead and find the reference to the pivot table. It's right here. Change that to PT. I don't need the with. I'll get rid of the with, and I'll bring orientation up onto this line. So now I can get rid of my position and my end with. I've converted that whole with block down to one statement. And so if I run this again, it should give me a new. Oh, I need a. I wanted a breakpoint here, so I wouldn't try to run this other code that I don't have yet. Run to that point, and sure enough, it's built my pivot table. It's put my label here as a column label. Okay, a little in-class exercise. I want you to look at these next 3 blocks and convert all 12 of those lines down to 3 lines that will put in your row labels. We just put in the column labels. We want state, school, and campus to show up here. And we'll take a break and do that. I'll give you 3 minutes. Okay, so it's just exactly analogous to doing the column field. We just choose the pivot field we're interested in, and then tell it what the orientation we want it to be. So that gets rid of these next 12 lines. Oh, this next one is really similar as well. So we're going to refer to the pivot table. And type, field called type, make the orientation a page field. And we've got that one pulled down as well. What are we doing here? Pivot table, pivot 5. Oh, we brought now, so here we brought the report year in as another column field. So to do this one, I'm just going to copy our column field, our label column field up here, duplicate that line, and the only thing that's different is I need to bring the report year instead of the label. So I'm going to change that. I'll make that first because I want that to be in the number 1 position, let label go in the number 2 position. You'll see it's actually pushing it, even though it's the second field in this orientation, it's pushing it into the number 1 position. So I'm replacing this block with just this line up. Got it? And I got a lot of scrolling. A whole lot of scrolling. Here's the scrolling. Selected A13. I probably don't need to select anything. Pivot 5. 5. Oh, now here we're telling it to collapse that field. So there's my reference to the pivot table. I'll change that to PT. I'm not going to show the detail. Same thing for state. Same thing for report year. Don't need to scroll, don't need to select. The sheet pivot table. Oh, here we're expanding Utah. So I'll do my reference to my pivot table. Bring that on the same line. Don't need to scroll. Clear all filters. Sheet pivot table, pivot type, clear all filters. Oh, and it's set to crime. I don't think I need to clear the filters. But it might be interesting to leave that code in here, depending on how we might use this procedure to configure other things. So we'll leave that. It's gonna, when it's brand new, it's going to be configured there as already cleared. But now we'll set the current page to be crime. And we are, that one we do need to select. We do need to select A1, and then we're freezing the panes. That's what gets it so it'll scroll properly when we're ready to scroll. Rather, that'll be so that the headings stay on top when we scroll. Well, that code was pretty hideous before, and now, if I got rid of those blank lines in there, we'd have at least this whole part that does the configuration would fit on one of these small screens. So I'm thinking I could pretty well now run this, and it should generate that whole pivot table just the way that we had it built out. Utah's already expanded, and the rest of it's configured the way we had it. Questions? Yes.
You just do a with statement and then have PT.
Oh, yeah. So we've got all these PTs in here. Could we just do one with statement and say, you know what, let's narrow this down? Yeah. Truth is, I think I favor the syntax that actually shows the PT, but we can say with PT. And do all those things. It makes a lot of sense to do that if you've got some kind of long expression to figure out what the pivot table is, or if in fact the very statement that created the pivot table was here. That makes a whole lot of sense. But here it's actually just the reference to that object, and so we're not picking up any efficiency by using the with structure here. But that's exactly what the with structure lets you do. With this object, do a bunch of manipulations. Do we have more above that I wasn't? Oh yeah, I missed some above. Move this up and do it all. Yeah, almost every line dealt with the pivot table. Okay, so now I would like to give myself another configuration. I'd like to have a configuration 2. In fact, we can probably just play with it. Play with the code right here. Let me take config 1. I'm going to copy it. Let's make it config 2. So we've got config pt2. And let's simplify this. Let's make the report year to be our filter. See our report filter, where's that one? We said type to be the current page. So we'll clear all filters. Let's see. Here it is. pivot field's going to be type. We're going to need to be able to clear off the existing filter. I'm not sure I have the code for that. So let me go ahead and record a little bit here. So what I'd like to be able to do is see how to remove this one. I don't have any code that's removing one. So I'm just going to go ahead and record it. My guess is the code's going to be really simple, so you'll be able to see it. Record it if you want to, but I'm going to record it and we'll take a look at it. So developer tab, port. And I'm just going to get rid of the type here. I'll move report year into that position, and we'll see what it will do. So, so I'm just going to set the orientation of type to hidden. So I'm going to come here and set the orientation type to hidden. I'm going to make report year to be, I forgot what it was called, Excel page field. There's hidden, and the report year is going to be page field. That'll give me only one column. I want only one row. I'm going to put state as the row. So we'll take these other ones and make them hidden. So I'm not going to have to worry about any of this show detail business. Clear all filters, current page. I'll get rid of these filters that we have here. So the point is, I'm just giving myself a different configuration to have here. I won't worry about freezing the panes. And so now I need a way to be able to call this, right? Because this has to have a pivot table passed to it. So I know some of you might still be working on the code here, so let me collapse this a little bit more. I'll make a new sub procedure here just to put this configuration in place. Sub config, call it config2. And what I want to do is just get a hold of the pivot table that's on the active sheet and pass that pivot table to config2. So let's take a look at how we refer to that. Active sheet dot pivot tables. Not count, look at collection of pivot tables. There's only one. So I'll just say pivot tables dot one dot name, and that's a valid reference to that pivot table. So all I'm going to do in config2 is call config pt2 and pass it a reference to the pivot table, the first pivot table on whatever sheet is active. So now when I call config pt2, it should look at the pivot table that's there and reconfigure it to have my report year as a filter at the top. I should still have data here. I should need to add that. Probably add another copy, so I'll get rid of that. It's already there. Depending on what I'm doing, I might need to make this a lot more. I might need to begin by saying, let's clear everything off and then just set what we want to have. I'm going to successfully be able to move back and forth between different configurations. But this should take that existing table and reconfigure it. So right now it's configured this way. I will choose View, or Developer, which is what I find first. View, Macros, and I'll run config2. And that is just reconfigured that one to be the way that I have it. Report year now is here at the top. I'll specify only one 2009, and I've got a simpler table here. So the trick here is that I can do, once the pivot table is created, I can kind of manipulate that however I want. So you can kind of see where you can go and say, I've got these 4 different styles I like. Click on a button to be able to set them up to be that way. And do it with just one pivot table.
Can you scroll up to the config
So that's coding pivot tables. If you wanted to actually have the sort of the pivot table be part of it, record yourself doing the sort. It puts a little thing that says sort based on this column, so that's pretty simple too. So you could kind of pre-configure different sorting preferences and so forth. So this hasn't been so much about learning how to use pivot tables, it's learning how to automate them. If you still don't know much about pivot tables, kind of a good thing to spend some time with. I think it must be the heat, but I am really feeling like dismissing class 7 minutes early. Yeah, we'll applaud for you today if you do that. Any other questions?
Can you scroll up?
Well, see, that kept us from dismissing class. This one here?
Just leave it there and that's all.
Then we can dismiss class. All right. Thanks for coming. Class dismissed.